Mr. President, our nation has an over $14 trillion debt and faces permanent deficits unless we can get a handle on our finances. I've got a chart here which I think shows what our future is going to look like if we stay on the current trajectory. As you can see, the path leads us to higher and higher debt to GDP levels that are unprecedented in American history. In fact, we're in unprecedented territory already. You have to go back to World War II to find a time when we had this kind of debt to GDP. As the chart shows, we're going to face an ever-increasing burden of debt, and without shoring up our finances, we know what our future is and what it's going to look like in this country. Just this week, we saw the country of Greece had to approve an austerity package to be eligible for their next disbursement of a multi-billion-dollar bailout loan from the IMF and from other European countries. This austerity package included 28.4 billion euros in spending cuts and tax increases, and that's exactly what happens if we don't do anything. We're going to be faced at a time when we will be faced with massive cuts in spending, massive tax increases, if we don't get our fiscal house in order. But that isn't necessary, Mr. President, because there is a better way to solve this problem. Instead of more debt and more spending, we could pass a balanced budget amendment that would prevent us from spending more than we take in. And we know what the effect of this is on our future as well. We have states all across this country, 49 states, that have some type of balanced budget requirement, including my home state of South Dakota. It's a reason why our state's budget is always balanced. Our legislature can't go home until that happens. We need that same sort of discipline here in Washington, D.C., and a balanced budget amendment would bring that. I have with me on the floor a colleague from the state of Nebraska, Senator Joe Hans, who also served as his state's governor. And I think, my understanding is at least, that the senator from Nebraska, when he was governor, had a balanced budget requirement in their constitution. And I wonder if you could explain what effect that had on your state and whether it forced you to make some of the tough choices that are necessary to get the budget balanced.
Well, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to speak about a topic that I think has made all the difference in the world for my state, the state of Nebraska. I did have the privilege a few years back of serving as the governor of the state of Nebraska until I came out to join the cabinet as Secretary of Agriculture. And I served about 6 years. Before that, I was the mayor of our state capital, the community of Lincoln, a great community. And we followed the same pattern, really, at the governor's office that I did at the mayor's office. And we governed with a simple principle. We did not spend money that we did not have. Now, before I talk about the balanced budget amendment, let me just explain to you how that worked as mayor of Lincoln. My budget staff would go to work. They worked on the budget pretty much year-round, really. It was a year-round endeavor. And at some point in the process, I would get a stack of paperwork that was about an inch thick with line after line after line after line of items that they were proposing that we needed to spend money on to keep the city running. And there would be everything from police cars to whatever, to salaries. And I mean, imagine what it takes to run a city, and it would be on that list. And I would go through it item by item, page by page, studying each entry, and ultimately reaching the conclusion for each entry, yes, I believe this is necessary to keep our city going. Well, somewhere in that thick stack of paperwork, I would turn over the page, and I would come to a page where there was a red line drawn through the items. And the significance of that red line was that everything above that red line we had money for. Everything below that red line there was no money for. And so if the next entry below the red line was something that I really wanted to see happen, then what I had to do as the chief executive of that community was to cut spending to eliminate something else. Because you see, when I went to the city council, I couldn't go to them and say, for operations, we're going to borrow a whole bunch of money. Well, it didn't really change at all when I became the governor of the state of Nebraska. Our Constitution requires a balanced budget. And it's very, very straightforward. It just basically says you can't spend more than what's coming in. You can't buy things that you don't have money for. But let me add another piece to this that makes our state quite a bit different, I think, than virtually any other state in the United States. See, way back when our Constitution was written, those who sat down to write the Constitution with amazing foresight said, you know, at some point, politicians in their passion to get reelected are going to say to the people, you can have all of this and then finance it by borrowing money. Well, they didn't want that. And so literally there's a provision in the Constitution that in essence says you can't borrow any money. I think the limit is like $100,000, $50,000 or $100,000. And that's it. You know, if you drive across the roads in Nebraska, I want to point out to you that they're paid for. Why? Because we don't spend money we don't have. Our Constitution will not allow us to do it. And so, year after year, when we get together, we look at the priorities of the state. It might be education. It might be something relative to human services. It might be roads, whatever it is. And the executive branch, me as governor, working with the legislature, would decide what we are going to fund and at what level. And I could guarantee people of Nebraska that three things would happen by the end of the legislative session. Number one, a budget would be passed. Number two, it would be balanced. And number three, we would not borrow money for those first two things to happen. A budget would be passed and it would be balanced, and we weren't going to borrow money to make that happen. And that's been going on for decades and decades and decades. Now, some are out there probably ready to rush down here to the floor and say, oh, Mike, that sounds so backward. And here's what I have to say. During this very difficult economic time, all of us agree it's been one of the toughest times since the Depression. Unemployment in Nebraska has not gone over 5%. Unemployment today in Nebraska is 4.1%. Let me say that a bit differently. 96% of people able to work in Nebraska have a job. 96%. Our legislature this year actually recessed early, and I believe I remember this correctly, they unanimously passed the state budget. Now, there's Democrats in the legislature, there's Republicans in the legislature, there's independents. How did they do that? They did that because they felt it a responsibility to the state and to their Constitution to get a budget done, to make sure it's balanced, and not to borrow money to get there. Now, let me contrast that with what's happening out here. What's happening out here is for decades and decades and decades, we as the federal government have said to the people, don't you worry. We can be all things to all people. We can give you this. We can give you that. Because we've got a big credit card. Well, that credit card today is now at $14.5 trillion and growing. Growing and growing and growing. And when I go back home and do town hall meetings and I look across the room and I see young people there or children, it pains me to tell them that I know who is going to be responsible to pay the credit card off. Not Mike Johans, who turned 61 this year, although it should be my responsibility. It's going to be our children and our grandchildren who have their own priorities, their own desires, their own wishes, and yet they're going to be saddled with trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars of debt before they can even address their priorities. I'll end with this thought. What's the merit of a balanced budget amendment? Well, when I was 20 years old, our nation owed $380 billion. $380 billion. It is projected that when I reach 65, just 4 short years from now, our nation will owe $20 trillion. It is time to be honest with the American people. You won't solve this problem unless you put discipline in place like our states have done, like the great state of Nebraska has done, that just essentially says, year after year, president after president, senator after senator, House member after House member, you're going to have to live within your means. And that's what the balanced budget is about. Because you see, without that, there'll be always a way to get around it, to do something, and not accept the responsibility of running this country with fiscal responsibility.
Well, I appreciate the comments from my colleague from Nebraska. As an executive, both as a mayor and a governor, he obviously has had to make the hard decisions that are necessary to get the books to balance in both in the city of Lincoln and in state of Nebraska. And it strikes me that, as you have observed, the economic circumstances in which the state of Nebraska finds itself today are so much better than other places around the country. And granted, there are lots of factors that contribute to that. Part of it, I think, has to do with the business climate in some states around the country, but clearly also a function of the discipline that the state of Nebraska imposes on itself through this balanced budget amendment, and the decisions that the leaders in that state, both legislators and governor, make in order to make that possible. And so the senator from Nebraska's experience, I think, is very valuable in helping us shape the debate that ought to occur here on a balanced budget amendment. And I would say that one of the features of the balanced budget amendment that we're both co-sponsoring is that it caps spending at 18% of our entire economy. And that's not a number that's picked out of thin air. That's a number that comes from a historical level of taxation for the past 40 years. And in the past 5 times that the budget was balanced here in Washington, and bear in mind 5 times probably in the last 40 years, spending averaged just under 18.7% of GDP, not too far off from what the balanced budget requirement, the cap that would be imposed under this amendment would require. And further, we know that in 2007, a year in which we had tax laws that are very similar to current tax laws, revenue was 18.5% of GDP. So if we could constrain spending to 18% of our entire economic output, we'd be able to balance the budget without raising taxes. Now, our colleagues on the other side seem to think that, continue to claim the problem could be fixed if we had only raised taxes on a few rich people, tax corporate jets, stop giving tax breaks to American energy production, those sorts of things. The truth is that the tax proposals from Democrats put only a relatively minor debt in the deficit. To truly balance the budget through tax increases, you would have to see astronomical rate increases that would hit not only high-income earners and corporations, but middle class and small businesses as well. So this is clearly not what the American people want. It's not what I want. Simply raising taxes on job creators isn't going to improve our economy. It's only going to hurt it more. And tax increases aren't the only threat to our economy. We also know that these current levels of debt are costing us about 1 million jobs a year as well, and that these debt levels are only predicted to increase. And I guess I would ask my colleague from Nebraska, in his experience as a governor, as a mayor, whether or not, when it came time to make these hard decisions about balancing the budget, did the notion of raising revenues, increasing taxes come into play? Because I'm sure that was a debate that always was raised. It always is. You know, you can either reduce the amount of spending or you can raise taxes on someone. And it strikes me the problem we have here in Washington is not that we don't have enough revenue. We've got plenty of revenue. We've just got too much spending. And I'm curious to know in the state of Nebraska if that was what his experience was in terms of this debate that we have here about more taxes or less spending.
We adopted the philosophy in the state of Nebraska that we wanted to be job creators. We wanted to have that low unemployment. And so we recognize that it's not government that's going to create the jobs. After all, people don't want a bigger, grander, greater state government or federal government for that matter. But our responsibility was to create the right climate so a small business had an opportunity to grow and expand, that a large employer looking across the United States for a great place to locate would know that they had an opportunity to grow and expand a business in the state of Nebraska. And so we fought like tooth and nail, and I'll give you a current example. If you dialed the clock back to about November of last year, you would see that our current governor, David Heineman, was faced with a great challenge. He had about $1 billion that he had to somehow make up to balance the budget over a 2-year cycle. Now, for a state like Nebraska, that is a powerful amount of money. You know, in Washington, where we talk about trillion-dollar programs like stimulus, et cetera, that may not sound like much, but it's a huge amount of money in our state. Now, I suppose our governor could have said, well, if we just hit the taxpayer here more and hit the taxpayer there more, then all of this will balance out. But he adopted very much the opposite view, which is exactly what I expect of Governor Heineman. And he said, we're going to balance the budget, and we're going to do it without raising taxes. And you know, when you think about it, that philosophy is absolutely right. You know, families are tightening their belt. They're balancing their budget. They're doing everything they can. They're suffering through economic times that are tough. Why would you hit them harder? Why would you go to your families who are already struggling and saying, I got to take more money out of your billfold and send it to the state capitol? And so he led, and he stepped forward, and he said, here's a plan to deliver a balanced budget. And you know what? He didn't send somebody else to go into that room. He went himself and said, this is a plan that I believe in for the future of our state. And he was there through every minute, every hour, every second of the legislative session. And at the end of it, with no tax increases, they balanced the budget. And like I said, I'll have to check this, but if memory serves me correctly, I think that plan passed unanimously. And in our state legislature, we have members who are more liberal than others, more conservative. We have some who are Democrats, some who are Republicans. But you know what? Our chief executive led. And again, I draw a sharp contrast here. There is one nationally elected official in our nation, and we call him Mr. President. The president pays the filing fee and convinces the nation that he or she is the right person to occupy that office, and there is no substitute for their leadership. We need to have our chief executive, the man we call Mr. President, deliver a plan that he believes is the right direction for our country. And That is the key to this issue. Now, I will be very clear. I like the plan of Governor Heinemann. In tough times, you pull back. When the revenues are a little bit better, you can do some things and establish some new priorities. But what happens out here is there is no prioritization. It's just spend on everything that walks by. And someday, our kids and grandkids are going to have to pay off the credit card. And I just don't think that's right.
I thank the senator from Nebraska for his observations about that. And I see in just a minute here, I want to turn to the ranking member of the Senate Budget Committee to talk about setting priorities, because that's something we're not doing here. I do want to point out in the course of this discussion, however, that what you have said is exactly right. You cut spending and you grow the economy. One of the things you need to do is you've got to create jobs, you've got to get economic expansion going. The way not to do that is to raise taxes. And that's the prescription that many of our colleagues on the other side would like is, well, let's just get more revenue, we'll raise taxes. That is absolutely the opposite thing that you would do when you've got a down economy and you're trying to create jobs. And so what we ought to be looking at is how do we reduce the size of government, get us living within our means, and getting the economy growing and expanding again and creating jobs. I want to point out one thing, though. This is important in my view, because we're planning right now to the extent that there's any planning going on here. And unfortunately, without a budget, it's very difficult to prioritize. But there are expectations about what revenues are going to be for the foreseeable future. There was an interesting piece earlier this week in the Wall Street Journal, an op-ed piece written by Larry Lindsay, who is a former economic advisor to President Bush and also former Federal Reserve governor, who pointed out that the current predictions for debts and deficits in the coming years are very, very optimistic for a couple of reasons. One is that the White House and the CBO are using very optimistic numbers for growth in our economy. And while I hope that they're correct, I am concerned that they could be very much overstating the potential for growth in our economy. If more realistic numbers were used, what Larry Lindsay recognized in that story was that the impact of the financial crisis on our economy, our debt numbers could jump by an additional $4 trillion over the next 10 years by assuming a more historic growth level given the times that we've been through. At the same time, the President and the CBO are also predicting that interest rates are going to remain much lower than they have historically. And what Mr. Lindsay pointed out in this op-ed was that if interest rates normalize, in other words, reset to what are the historical averages, it would cost us an additional $4.9 trillion over the next 10 years to finance our debt than what we're currently expecting. So those two factors alone would have an $8.9 trillion negative impact on these forecasts for the next decade. And so again, points to the importance of getting spending under control and doing it now. He finally pointed out that the new health care law is another significant hidden cost. And that if you look at what employers are increasingly being faced with, many of them are going to choose to dump their employees into these public exchanges, and that you're going to see the additional cost of anywhere from about $74 to $85 billion a year over the next 10 years. So you start adding that up, you add in the economic growth assumptions, assuming that they, and again, I hope that they are right, but assuming that they are wrong and that you have lower levels of economic growth, what I think are probably more realistic levels. If you have more realistic interest rates, at least in terms of historical averages, these long-term predictions just get awful in a real hurry. And the nice thing about having a balanced budget amendment is you are forced to make those decisions every year. Instead of dealing with these long-term predictions, which are often inaccurate, each and every year the budget has to be balanced. So if interest rates go up, the budget's got to be balanced. If employers put their employees on the exchanges, the budget's got to be balanced. If there are fictional savings from these independent payment advisory boards that are being created and those aren't realized, the budget's got to be balanced. If taxes don't produce as much revenue as predicted, the budget's got to be balanced. I mean, this is the very simple solution that, as the senator from Nebraska pointed out, so many states have come to. So many states have concluded that you've got to have some sort of a requirement to balance the budget. It is the most powerful fiscal reform that we could ever have here in Washington, D.C. We've got credit agencies that are questioning our long-term budget outlook. If we did a balanced budget amendment, I think that there wouldn't be any question that our country would be able to pay all of our bills. Now, I was a member of the House of Representatives back in 1997. I think the senator from Alabama was here at the time. There was a vote on a balanced budget amendment at that time. And we didn't vote on it in the House because the Senate voted on it first. The Senate came within one vote, one single vote, of passing a balanced budget amendment. Had they done that, we would have been able to pass it in the House. We had the votes for it. We could have sent it on to the states. And I can't help but thinking how different our fiscal situation would be today if they'd had that one additional vote back in 1997 to get us a balanced budget amendment. Now, many of our colleagues here campaign on a balanced budget amendment, but hopefully when we get a chance to vote on it, and I hope we do here in the next few weeks, we'll see whether or not the rhetoric matches up with the actions here. But all that to say, we've got a major fiscal challenge facing this country. For all the reasons the senator from Nebraska noted, we are handing our children a burden of debt that is not fair to them, trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars. We have got to bring some discipline to the process of budgeting around here. And what's unfortunate, and this is why I want to turn to our colleague from Alabama, because he is the ranking member on the Senate Budget Committee, we have done nothing in 792 days to prioritize spending. This federal government spends $3.7 trillion annually of the taxpayers' money, and we have not passed a budget for 792 days, let alone one that actually balances. And so, my state of South Dakota spends annually about $3 billion. This federal government borrows $4 billion every single day. The borrowing of the federal government exceeds in one day what the state of South Dakota spends in an entire year. That is the dimension of the problem that we are dealing with. All that being said, it's been 792 days since we produced a budget here in the United States Senate. And so I would say to my colleague from Alabama, clearly this is a problem that needs to be addressed. Wouldn't you say that this is reflective of the lack of political courage, the lack of political will, the lack of discipline around here? We've got colleagues on the other side who say we don't need a balanced budget amendment. That's a gimmick. All we got to do is balance the budget. Well, where is it? Where is the budget? And where is the budget that's supposed to balance? It's not happening. And so I think the balanced budget amendment is a simple, straightforward way in which to deal with a massive challenge facing us in the future. And we need some discipline imposed upon federal spending on the Congress that so many states have. And as the senator from Nebraska pointed out, as a governor of his state, he was able to exercise. And so I would refer to my colleague from Alabama, just to ask him his thoughts about where we are with regard to the budget, and is our lack of discipline here, is our lack of a willingness to pass a budget not a reflection of the lack of discipline that exists in the Congress today, and an unwillingness to make the hard choices that are necessary to get this fiscal train back on track?